here. We're delighted to be joined by, you can all hear me, yeah? We're delighted to be joined by Catharine Boothroyd, who is the director of the MD-PhD program at Cornell. She did a PhD from Rockefeller and graduated maybe 10 years ago or so, and went on to teach science at high schools before joining the Weill Cornell MD PhD program. So she's going to tell us a little bit about how to apply to MD PhD programs. And yeah, we're delighted to have you, Catharine. Thank you so much for being here. As with the other talks, or the other talk this morning from Dr. Lacruz, you can ask questions in the Q&A section that you'll see at the bottom, and we will put them to Catharine when she's finished with her presentation. So thank you so much, Catharine, and thank you everyone else for being here.
Thank you, Joe. Just before I share my screen, I wanted to say how honored I am to be here today. I also really enjoyed the talk from Dr. De La Cruz. As Joe said, just a little bit about my background. I went to a small state college for undergrad. I went to the State University of New York at Purchase. I then attended Rockefeller University. I matriculated in 2000 and graduated in 2006. I will say that in terms of my background, I was never really sure whether I was good at science because I liked it, or I liked science because I was good at it. And in some ways, I fell into academic science by accident. I thought that if I was good at science, that meant I had to go to medical school. I did a work-study program as an undergrad and ended up in a lab studying human sleep disorders. And that was my first exposure really to PhD, the PhD path. I came to Rockefeller because I wanted to work with Mike Young. So I did my PhD on circadian rhythms in Drosophila. And then I went on to do a postdoc on antigenic variation in the parasites Trypanosoma brucei. And this brings us to 2011. I also had 3 children at this time and wasn't really sure whether I could manage my own lab. I had some doubts for a long time about staying in academia, and I had always had a passion for outreach and education, and was involved with the undergraduate research program at Rockefeller, and also with the high school program at Rockefeller. And so I took the leap from the bench to the classroom, and as Joe said, I taught high school for 7 years. I taught chemistry and biology, and also started a small research program. And I really enjoyed working with young people, but I also missed academia. And so when the opportunity presented itself to come back to the tri-institutional area, I joined the tri-institutional MD-PhD program in 2018. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the MD-PhD path in general. But if you have questions specifically about the tri-institutional MD-PhD program, I welcome you to reach out to me. So I'm going to share my screen. And start my presentation. And okay, can everyone see what they're supposed to see? Thumbs up. Joe, can you see it? Yes? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Some of the data I'm going to present today is from the AAMC, which is why I'm acknowledging it on the bottom. One of the questions, if I was giving this presentation to a live audience, I would ask you what you think a physician scientist is. And so since we can't do that, I'm going to show you a slide. We have a summer program for undergraduates from backgrounds that are underrepresented in science and medicine. They spend 10 weeks on campus. And at the end of their 10 weeks, we ask them this question. And this was their answer to what a physician scientist is. I particularly like the insane, but you can see that it's sort of all over the place, and and kind of exciting. So officially, the mission of MD-PhD programs is to educate and train physician scientists, as I mentioned, who are prepared to bridge the gap between clinical medicine, so at the bedside, and laboratory research, so at the bench. And this gap is brought about by technological developments and specialization, both at the bedside and at the bench. And really, graduates of MD-PhD programs are prepared to be leaders in all aspects of modern biomedical research and academic medicine. So MD-PhDs tend to go into research fields, and within research fields, they do basic research, disease-oriented research, otherwise known as translational research, patient-oriented research, and sometimes even epidemiological or population-oriented research. MD-PhDs also go into clinical medicine. They can be generalists or specialists. And sometimes they go into teaching, and sometimes the basic sciences and other clinical disciplines. So physician scientists, as you saw in the previous slide, tend to work at the intersection of science and medicine. And really the job of MD-PhD programs are to give individuals the training to work at that interface. I will say, and I'm going to come back to this concept again, is that an MD-PhD is not equal to an MD plus a PhD, and there's several ways in which they differ. So MD-PhD programs, there's about 90 of them across the US. All of them are affiliated with medical schools. And you might have heard the term MSTP, or Medical Scientist Training Programs. So all MSTPs are MD-PhD programs, but not all MD-PhD programs are MSTPs. So just over half of the MD-PhD programs in the country are supported by a grant from the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of General and Medical Sciences. And this is a large T32 grant that supports trainees throughout their MD-PhD training. Within the MSTP programs, they range from small to medium to pretty large, with 190 trainees. Our program at Tri-I is on the larger side. We have 150 trainees right now. Most MD-PhD programs, especially those that have an MSTP grant, offer financial support. So they give a stipend, which basically covers the cost of living. They waive your tuition for medical and graduate school, and they offer health insurance. So many of you, or most of you right now, are college students. And if you're at this talk, you're thinking about becoming a physician scientist. So how do you get there? The most straightforward path is to matriculate at an MD-PhD program, but it's not the only path that you can take to becoming a physician scientist. You can go to medical school. There are many MDs who are physician scientists who have their own lab or have an appointment in somebody else's lab. You can go to medical school and transfer into an MD-PhD program while you're in medical school. Several of our students matriculated at medical school and at Cornell anyways, and I think this is in fashion across the country in medical schools, we have a program called an areas of concentration, where medical students have to do 6 months of research to earn their MD. And many of them discover that they really like research and take an extra year to get more experience, and then decide that they really would like a PhD out of it. And so they approach us about transferring into the MD-PhD program. You can become a physician scientist. It's actually pretty difficult to become a physician scientist with just a PhD. So I'm going to talk about the difference, and if you're on the fence. If you're an MD, you can pick up a pipette, but if you're a PhD, it's going to be hard to pick up a stethoscope. most MD-PhD programs will not allow transfer from the PhD phase to the MD-PhD phase, but there are PhD students who have gone on to pursue their MD after PhD. But obviously with a PhD, you can go on and do clinical research, even if you cannot work directly with patients. So the mission of the physician scientist is to promote better health and enhance the quality of life by reducing disability and death from disease. And in order to promote health, it is necessary to understand both normal body functions and then also how and why disease develops, so abnormal pathophysiology. In order to do that, we need to understand how our genes and genes products interact, not only with each other and the organism, but also with the environment. And we need to understand this in the context of both health and in disease. In other words, we need to think in terms of mechanisms. And so this is just sort of a schematic of, you know, from the micro to molecules and below, right? Interacting in increasing hierarchical systems with, especially as a physician scientist, the whole body. But it's also important to think about how that organism, the human, interacts with its environment, and then vice versa, how the environment influences the human body down to molecular systems. And I'm going to give an example of this. Cystic fibrosis is a disease that's due to a single polymorphism change that results in a genetic defect in chloride secretion across the luminal membrane of the epithelial membranes and exocrine glands, and it also affects the intestines and airways. This, as I said, is a molecular defect. It's a point mutation in an ATP-dependent chloride channel called CFTR. The mutant CFTR protein is degraded by the ERAD pathway. And in other words, because it's degraded, the protein does not reach the plasma membrane. Cystic fibrosis is fatal, but interestingly, if you culture epithelial cells with the absence of CFTR, they're not affected. So in the dish, this mutation is inconsequential, but in the organism, it's lethal. And so, as I said here, right, basically only when these cells are organized into secretory epithelia, does chloride secretion become an issue. And so really, this is where, you know, like clinical research and understanding the difference between a molecular defect in a dish and understanding a molecular defect in an organism, in other words, mechanisms, becomes important. I will also say that the same genetic defect can result in, diverse or disparate clinical presentations among individuals. And so that's something that is probably affected by the environment. Okay, so I said earlier that the MD-PhD degree is not simply a sum of an MD and a PhD degree. So when students go to medical school, they learn a lot of information about a lot of topics. And so at Weill Cornell, for example, you start off with a course on essential principles of medicine, and then 2 semesters of health, illness, and disease. But you basically, you know, start talking about cells and then normal and abnormal physiological pathways. There's a lot of information, and because there's so much information, you don't go very deep into it. A PhD, on the other hand, by the time you earn your PhD, you are the world expert in a very small field. And so you can't both be the world expert in a small field and have all this sort of broad information. It is much more integrated than that. So we say that our students wear both their MD and their PhD hats at all times. They take their broad knowledge of human physiology with them into the lab, and they take their their curiosity and their ability to ask deeper questions from their PhD training into the clinic. So at all times, MD-PhD students are both medical students and graduate students. This is reflected a little bit in the structure of MD-PhD training. This is a schematic from our training, but most MD-PhD programs in the country follow this sort of overall sandwich model, which people refer to as a 2-4-2. So MD-PhD students, when they start, generally start with 2 years of medical school training. For us, I will add that we do a laboratory rotation the summer before medical school. And so in the first 2 years of medical school, as I said, there's a basic coursework that takes about 18 months. And then students at Weill Cornell and at many schools now will undergo a few clinical clerkships. So they get to be in the clinic. This is relatively new, but they get to be in the clinic before they start their PhD training. At Cornell, our students do 2 more rotations this summer between their first and second year of medical school. Once they complete their preclinical courses and their early clinical rotations, students then matriculate at a graduate school, and they spend between 3.5 and 4.5 years studying for their PhD. This is a typically shorter timeline than a PhD only student, and part of the reason is because we and other programs give credit for the classes they've taken as a medical student, so there is less coursework. And there's also some pressure to sort of, they've done rotations already, right? So they're not matriculating at a PhD program and doing 1 or 2 years of rotations. They matriculate directly into a lab. They have about a year to present a thesis research proposal. And overall, the understanding is that they have to sort of finish up in time to get back to the clinic, because as I'm going to show you in a few slides, training is pretty long. And you can even add it up here, but it doesn't end at the end of 7 or 8 years. It's not PhD light though. Our students and students across the country who do an MD PhD earn their PhD. After the PhD, students go back to medical school. At Weill Cornell, they do 1.5 years, and they finish their core clerkships, and then they do electives, take their board exams, and apply for residency. So what's so special about the MD-PhD path in terms of education and training? I've alluded to some of this. If you compare the MD-PhD to the MD, you have structured research training that you don't get in an MD-only pathway. If you compare an MD-PhD to a PhD, you probably end up with more understanding of basic human biology. In other words, how normal and abnormal function result from interactions at many levels of specialization. This is a long path. So not only is your degree or your dual degree about 8 years, but just because you earn your MD, it does not make you a physician. It prepares you to become one. And just because you earn your PhD, it does not make you a scientist. It prepares you to become one. So most MD PhD students go on to do a residency, depending on your field. That's another 3 to 5 years of training. If you want to practice clinical medicine, especially if you want to practice a specialty, then you need to go do a fellowship, and that's another 1 to sometimes 4 years of training. And then if you want a research program, you need to do a postdoctoral fellowship, and that adds another 1 to 3 years on that. So after the 8 years of MD PhD training, you're thinking about another 6 to 10 years of postgraduate training, which is a problem in MD PhD training right now, because if you do the math, many individuals are not applying for or getting their first academic job until their late 30s, early 40s. Yeah, and this is an issue. One way around this is to do what's called a PSTP, a physician scientist training program. that combines research and residency, but it doesn't take a lot off the postgraduate timeline. So this is something to think about when you are contemplating the MD-PhD path. I will add here, I've heard from students that one of the motivations to study an MD-PhD is financial. Yes, it is. You do not, your $200,000 of medical school is covered. But if you sort of balance that with the fact that you are not earning your full potential until you're in your late 30s or 40s, it pretty much evens out. And so the financial is not, I would discourage you from using that as a primary motivator. Oh, yes, so it's important to be efficient. MD-PhD students can't stay in training forever, even though I just told you that you kind of need to. So what can you do when you're done with your training? MD-PhDs, as I said at the beginning, they go into research, they go into clinical medicine, and they go into administration. I would say that you could probably do 2 of these 3 things well, but it's very difficult to do all 3. Many of our graduates also go into industry and public policy. We have students, alums who are at the NIH, the New York City Department of Health, and other areas like that. So, but there is a wide range of fields that you could enter. And really MD-PhDs can do this because they've trained to identify important problems and acquired the skills to solve them. These data are from the AAMC. Nationwide, about 60%, or sorry, almost 70% of MD-PhD graduates enter academia. For our program, it's actually over 80. That's the desired, so very few go into private practice. It is not, if you want to end up in private practice, doing the MD-PhD or undertaking an MD-PhD is probably not the way to go. And then about between 5 and 7% end up in institutes like the National Institutes of Health, industry, and other fields. Within academia, I would say, yeah, so you can see the slide here, about 70% undertake translational research and other basic sciences and patient-oriented research. So a little bit about the admissions process. As of September 1st, as of last month, there were just over 5,700 MD-PhD trainings enrolled in these 90 programs that I described at the beginning of my talk. And this is just over 6% of the total medical school population. So it's a pretty small percentage. I will say that's something to look at when you are looking at MD-PhD programs. What % of your incoming class will you be? Will you be one of 50? Will you be 20 of 100? It makes a difference for how you, maybe it doesn't make a difference to you, but it can for, do you have a cohort? Of these 5,700 MD-PhD trainees, just over 40% are female, and 14 to 20% come from underrepresented backgrounds. The discrepancy in the statistics for URM backgrounds is really because of reporting. And so the AAMC distinguishes between people who identify as one race or ethnicity, and they also ask if they're multiple, if you identify as multiple races or ethnicities, and it's really hard to pull out the actual statistics. So I would say it's somewhere between these two, that range. For the last year cycle, there were just over 1,800 applicants. Almost 50% were female. Again, the number of students from underrepresented backgrounds is pretty low. About just over a third of applicants in last year's cycle actually matriculated at a program. 46% female, and between 10 and 20% of students from underrepresented backgrounds. This means that each applicant submitted approximately 14 applications each. In terms of statistics, so I'll talk a little bit about what programs we're looking for. But if you look at the students who successfully matriculated at an MD-PhD program, they had an average MCAT of 516. This is about the 93rd percentile, with a range of 501 to the maximum, which is 528, and an average GPA of 3.8, with a range of 2.77 to 4.0. Standards are pretty high, but you can see from these statistics that you don't need to be perfect. And this has been a trend or a topic trending on Twitter for a while, sort of the imperfect MD-PhD applicant. And yeah, so I think programs, we definitely look at applicants holistically. And so, you're human. I was a little torn whether to put this slide in here. As you probably gathered from, I obviously did not enter an MD-PhD program, but I kind of fell into the PhD pathway by accident. So it's hard to enter an MD-PhD program if you just discover the MD-PhD pathway as a junior or senior in college. You need to have a significant amount of research experience, as well as the core classwork. So it's really something that I mentioned our Gateways program. We accept rising sophomores and juniors, which means that students apply to us when they're freshmen and sophomores, and we mentor them then for applying to programs. A lot of students now are taking gap years to get, they're either discovering the pathway, the MD-PhD pathway a little bit later, or they're discovering that maybe they're not so sure and they want more research experience. But it is, you definitely have to plan ahead. And as with graduate school applications, medical school application process is, it's actually over a year. The application for this cycle opened on June 1st. And we're interviewing now for next July. So what do MD-PhD programs seek in their applicants? We definitely look for applicants with integrity and maturity. We would like our applicants to show a passion for research, a concern for others, they are going to be physicians, an aptitude for working with others, and definitely leadership potential. We also look for a diverse student body. It's very important to our program and to programs across the country. And when we look at a student's application, there's a few areas we focus on. Research experiences are really important for MD-PhD, and not only the experience itself, but the ability to discuss your research. And this is the same for PhD. But you need to be able to discuss your research in terms of mechanisms, in terms of leading your own project, and I guess, and also like where your project fits into the larger field. We do look at your academic records, including your MCAT scores. We have adjusted that a bit for this cycle based on issues with taking the MCAT due to COVID-19. We look at your personal statement very carefully. Why do you need the dual degree? What do you want to do with your career that you cannot do with an MD only or a PhD only? And that's something I would encourage anyone who's in this talk to really think about, because as I said, it's a long pathway, and this is something that you're going to have to articulate to anyone interviewing you. We look very closely at your letters of recommendation. If you have had a research experience, include a letter. If it was in high school, maybe not. But if you had an experience as an undergraduate, or as a postbac, it is a red flag if there's no letter from that research advisor. For MD PhD, as again, you are applying to medical school as well, so you need some shadowing experience. I actually don't like the term shadowing, and I find it very passive, but you need some experience in the clinic. And we look at your extracurricular activities and your life experiences. What is a substantive research experience? Really, it can range from multiple summer projects to a senior thesis research experience, or even, as I said, post-bac training. But what we're looking for is your ability to test a hypothesis, and as I said before, to understand how your research fits into the larger field. So we don't want to hear about PCRs and Western blots. We want to understand the background, that you understand the background of your research. When you go for an interview, you definitely, I should add that we're doing all our interviews remotely this year, but you should show your positive personality and creativity. You should definitely demonstrate your communication skills. You should research the program you're interviewing at and have specific questions about that program. As I said before, you should be able to describe and discuss in detail your research projects and be aware of the progress in the larger field that you're in. You should, as I said, be able to describe and discuss your career goals and articulate why you need both degrees. And to some extent, you should be, if you put it in your application, you should be willing to discuss it. I think there are limits there. There are things that one puts in an application that are uncomfortable to discuss with another person. That's something we're trying to address in this cycle. Yeah. What should you be looking for in an MD-PhD program? So the research environment is going to be very important. Are there research opportunities that fit with your specific interests and background? For example, we are affiliated with Weill Cornell Medical College, the Rockefeller University, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. However, the tri-institutional MD-PhD program, even though it's affiliated with Weill Cornell, is not affiliated, or at least students can't do research at Cornell Ithaca. I mention this because many applicants will say, can I work in an engineering lab at Cornell Ithaca? No, you can't. So if you have an engineering background and you want to pursue a PhD in engineering, you need to find a PhD or an MD-PhD program that offers PhDs in engineering. Same if you want to study public health or any of your subspecialties. Make sure that the program has labs that do that research. Look very closely at the academic environment. What is the PhD curriculum? What is the clinical curriculum? How does the program integrate those two curricula? How is the program organized? What's their involvement with the larger community of the city or the town they're in? What is the integration within the program itself? Is there communication between the first years and the 8th years? Is there vertical integration? Is there support for the students? At Tri-I, we have 3 MD-PhD specific groups. We have FACES, which is the Female Association of Clinicians, Educators, and Scientists. We have ADAPT, which is the Association for Diverse Physician Scientists in Training. And we have QUIPS, which is the queer interest in physician scientist training. And we also have a house system, which provides for vertical integration. So look for support for the students. Ask yourself, who do you go to for advice? I've met very few students, MD and PhD, who don't run into trouble every so often. So who can they speak to? Training, as I said, is long. If you don't want to be in a big city, don't apply to schools in big cities. If you don't want to be in a rural environment, don't apply to schools in a rural environment. Same thing, if you don't want to be on the if your significant other is on the East Coast, think very carefully about applying to the West Coast. You want to make sure that this is a good fit for you. And really you want to make sure that there's people around you. And I don't mean this as, sort of an imposter syndrome smarter than you, but you should have students around you who can challenge you and help you grow. So what do you do if you're in doubt? If you continue to be in doubt between an MD and an MD-PhD, I would encourage you to choose the MD. As I said at the beginning, you can transfer, you can sort of switch back over if you find that your passion for research is really there. But it is a long haul, and if you think you're more interested in clinical training, probably the MD path is right for you. If you are in doubt between a PhD and an MD-PhD, I would say go for the MD-PhD. because also, as I said at the beginning, with a PhD, it's very difficult to have access to human subjects, and the MD will provide you that access. So I spoke a lot about MD-PhD training and applications in general, a little bit about our program. As I said, we're a tri-institutional program. We are a collaboration between Weill Cornell Medical College, Weill Cornell Graduate School, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and the Rockefeller University. We are located at the corner of 69th and York in Manhattan. Behind me, you can see some of our buildings. And if you want more information about our program, I encourage you to go to our website, which is mdphd.weill.cornell.edu. You're also welcome to send me an email if you have questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions now. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was really very informative and I'm sure useful for attendees. So if anyone has any questions, they're very welcome to post them in the Q&A section. While I sort of give people an opportunity to gather their thoughts and do that, I thought I would ask you a question, Catherine, which is just, I wonder what facet of the program at the TRIO program you're most sort of proud of and you think is the sort of best feature.
So I think community is really what I'm most proud of in our program. And I can think of a few examples. So when I came to the program in 2018, the person who had this position before me had been there for over 20 years. And this is a huge change for everyone. And I think just the welcoming atmosphere and the willingness to give me grace and not compare to how things were done and really let me develop my own style. Our students are also always eager to, to share their voice and help out. The programs I mentioned, ADEPT, QUIPS, and the House system were all founded in the last 2 years. And all of them build community. Yeah, and even just our remote interview days, which are coming up in a couple weeks, they depend on student involvement to show community. That's really what I miss the most in COVID-19, is the loss of these small, like the in-between moments, I think, that we lose when you're waiting in line for food or somebody's walking you to an interview. You can't replicate that via Zoom. And then the other way that our community participates in the program, I would say over 50% of our students participate in our Gateways program. And they do that by being big sibs, by moderating journal club, by offering mock interviews, and other ways that they participate. So yeah, definitely community.
That's a really wonderful thing to hear. We have a question, which is, how can we write our personal statement in a way that is not leaning too much towards either MD or PhD? How can we make it clear that our passion is shown for both of them without giving the idea that we have a preference of one over the other?
So I actually think that your whole application is a story, and the story should be about your goal to becoming a physician scientist. And that includes, so in the MD-PhD application, there is a personal statement, and then also in the secondary, there's an essay on why you want to become an MD-PhD. Personally, if I read your personal statement and only see that you want to become a clinical physician, and then for the first time hear the word physician or read the word physician scientist in your why MD-PhD essay, it's a little bit of a red flag. So you don't think you have to talk in your personal statement entirely about a physician scientist, but you should hint that your goal is to integrate research into your training as a physician. At the same time, I wouldn't spend your entire personal statement talking about your research background. And so I hope that answered a little bit of the question about the personal statement, but your recommenders too should understand that you want to train to become a physician scientist. And so it's really important when they write those letters that they're not writing, you know, I recommend so-and-so to go to medical school, right? They should be writing, I recommend, or I am writing to strongly recommend so-and-so to enter an MD-PhD program. Again, it's the whole application is going to tell a story.
Cool. I'll just offer anyone another opportunity to ask a question, and also just say my experience of applying to graduate school, I completely echo that. It's so important to have a really close line of communication with your recommenders, and make sure you're very much on the same page about how they're going to support your application. We have another question. I was wondering your opinion on having a committee letter and if it is preferred. Thank you for a great talk, Catherine.
So the committee letter, it's not mandatory, but if your school offers a committee letter, it can also be a red flag if you're missing it. The committee letter can sort of tie together, again, part of the idea that your application is a story. It can tie together your personal statement and your letters, and just put it sort of in one place for the people who read your application. It is, again, it's not mandatory, but if your school offers it, I would encourage you to be involved with your pre-health advisors.
Great. And we have another question. You mentioned needing extensive research experience. How late in your undergraduate career is too late to get involved with research prior to applying?
I don't know that there's such a thing as too late. I mean, I think, you know, if you're getting involved as a junior or senior, then I would definitely encourage you to do a postbac. It's especially if you, excuse me, especially since I just told you, if you want to go straight from undergrad to MD PhD, you're applying when you're a senior. So, and the AMCAS application will ask you for your total research hours. If they are low, that's a little bit of a red flag. But we've had students who, I think it's also something you need to explain, your trajectory, why you're encountering research so late. But you want to make that up at some point. So there's a lot of, many students go on to do an IRTA at the NIH. There's a number of postbac programs across the country, prep programs that offer usually 1 to 2 years of structured postbac training. Or you can apply to be a research technician in a lab, although you will get less formal training that way.
Great, we have one more. I loved your talk, Catherine. I was wondering, how can applicants give a memorable interview? A classic question.
I think, I mean, to go back to Dr. De La Cruz's talk, be yourself. So bring your whole self, bring your enthusiasm, do your homework, and understand not only the program you're applying to, but the people you're interviewing with. I mean, some interviewers like to talk about their own research, so it's good to have a sense of what their research is, and be prepared for sort of the tough questions about your own research. As I said, hopefully you understand where it fits into your field, and then also, you know, what your future goals are. So I think preparation for you know, for MD PhD, for MD, for PhD, you have to do some homework and understand the environment in which you're interviewing in.
How many interviews can you expect to do, Catherine?
That's a tough question. You know, there's a reason that people apply to, on average, 14 schools. So I will also add that if you're going to apply to MD PhD, you should apply early. When the AMCAS application opens on June 1st, you should be able to hit send. Because depending on the program, there's only so many interview slots. So for us this year, we're interviewing 75 individuals, and we had over 600 applications. I will say though that we cannot possibly interview all the qualified individuals, but they do get interviews somewhere. So, I mean, I think some people, you know, they get one interview and some people may have 10. And sometimes they have to choose.
Cool. We'll give people another opportunity to ask any other questions. Thank you so much. You've been so detailed in your responses, which has been fantastic for people. Okay, doesn't look like we're getting any more questions for the moment. Yeah. So I think I'll give people another 60 seconds and then I think we'll wrap up and say thank you, if not so. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. That was extremely illuminating and I think really helpful for people as they think about their next stage in their development as a scientist or physician scientist. We really appreciate you spending the time and giving us your wisdom and thoughts on the subject. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem.
Bye.
I think Mari is probably in a better position to advise about this, but I think we will take a break now and the programming will resume shortly thereafter.
Yeah, so right now we're going into an extended